Somewhere in the Bay of Bengal, there is an island you are not allowed to visit, not because of bureaucracy, not because of permits or restricted military zones, because the people who live there will kill you. The Sentinelese have fired arrows at helicopters, killed a missionary who came bearing fish and hymns, and turned back every attempt at sustained contact for as long as anyone has been trying. The world has largely taken the hint, but while no linguist has decoded their language and no anthropologist has ever sat inside their homes, science found a different way in, not through contact, through DNA. The same technology that has been rewriting Bronze Age history is now telling us something extraordinary about these islands. And what it reveals doesn't just explain one remote tribe, it changes the story of how humanity itself spread across the planet. North Sentinel Island is small enough to feel like an accident of geography. 60 square kilometers of dense tropical forest rising out of the Bay of Bengal, roughly square in shape, ringed entirely by coral reefs that have wrecked more than one vessel that got too close. Two peaks push about 120 meters above sea level near the center of the island, which matters more than it sounds. When the 2004 tsunami moved through the Indian Ocean, those elevations likely saved lives. The island sits around 40 kilometers from the main Andaman chain, close enough to see on a clear day, far enough to remain genuinely separate. From above, it looks like any other forested tropical island. From the water, it looks like somewhere that does not want you. The people who live there have no name we know for themselves. We call them the Sentinelese, after the island, which is itself a name they had no part in choosing. Population estimates range from 50 to 400 individuals, a spread so wide it tells you almost everything about how little direct observation has ever been possible. What we can see from a distance suggests a population that is healthy, active, and not particularly short on food. The surrounding waters provide fish, turtles, and shellfish in abundance. The forest offers birds and almost certainly boar, given that Portman noted a pile of boar skulls near a village on his 1880 expedition, which is either evidence of hunting or the world's most unsettling garden feature. Their technology is genuinely fascinating and consistently underestimated. They work iron, which immediately sounds wrong for a so-called Stone Age people, but is entirely accurate. They just don't smelt it. They scavenge it. Shipwrecks have been delivering raw material to these shores for centuries, and the Sentinelese have been cold working it ever since, scoring metal with hard stone flakes, bending and snapping until a usable blank emerges, then grinding an edge with abrasive rock. The result is arrowheads that early visitors specifically noted were tipped with iron. The arrows themselves are long, nearly the height of the shooter, barbed just behind the point in a design that works equally well for fish and for discouraging anthropologists. Their canoe are narrow outriggers, steered with poles rather than paddles, which limits them to shallow coastal waters but makes them highly effective for exactly the kind of fishing and hunting their environment demands. Physically, they are a smaller framed people, similar in appearance to the neighboring Andamanese. And here is where things get interesting. Because despite appearances that have led generations of observers to draw the wrong conclusions, genetically they are not what they look like. Not even close. That thread leads somewhere that changes everything. The written history of contact with North Sentinel Island begins, as so many colonial-era records do, with someone seeing something and wisely deciding not to investigate further. In 1771, John Ritchie of the East India Company noted fires on the shore and sailed on. No casualties. Excellent decision-making. It would be nearly a century before anyone else felt compelled to comment. In 1867, an Indian merchant vessel called the Nineveh was wrecked by a monsoon on the reef. All 86 crew members made it to the beach. For 2 days they survived without incident, apparently unaware of exactly whose beach they were on. On the third morning they found out. The captain recorded that attackers came with arrows tipped with iron, which tells you something important. By 1867, the Sentinel had already been working salvaged metal long enough that it had become standard equipment. The Royal Navy eventually arrived and extracted the survivors. Everyone lived. That outcome would not always repeat. Then came M.V. Portman. In 1880, the British officer appointed to oversee the Andaman Islands arrived at North Sentinel with a large expedition party. Portman was a complicated figure with, let's say, a variety of unusual personal interests that probably deserve their own documentary. What concerns us here is what he did on the island. On his second visit, his team encountered a Sentinelese family in thick forest. A confrontation followed. Portman's own journal records that they captured 6 individuals and transported them to Port Blair in the interest of science. The 2 adults died almost immediately. The 4 children were returned to the island with gifts, almost certainly carrying diseases their immune systems had no framework for. Portman later wrote that the expedition had accomplished nothing except increasing the general terror of outsiders. He was, at minimum, right about that. The broader Andamanese experienced this pattern on a civilizational scale. British colonization brought disease, forced labor, and the Battle of Aberdeen, where roughly 1,500 islanders with bows faced men with firearms and a cannon offshore. The outcome was not close. Within decades, populations that had thrived independently for millennia were dying from measles and malnutrition in settlements they had not chosen. The Sentinelese watched none of this directly, but the island's reputation for hostility hardened through every decade of the 19th century, almost certainly for reasons that made complete sense from where they were standing. In 1896, an escaped convict from Port Blair reached the island on a makeshift raft. A search party found him on the beach, dead, filled with arrows. After that, the island was largely left alone for the better part of half a century. The boundary had been established. It was not subtle. John Allen Chow was born in Alabama in 1991 and grew up reading adventure stories about frontier missionaries and boys befriending native peoples on the edges of the known world. He attended a Christian high school, became an avid outdoorsman, and somewhere along the way developed a specific, consuming obsession with bringing the gospel to isolated tribes. He trained for it deliberately, taking wilderness survival courses and studying linguistic anthropology. He even cited Jim Elliot, a missionary killed by a tribal group in Ecuador, as an inspiration, which, as far as warning signs go, is fairly unambiguous. He identified North Sentinel Island specifically as his destination and described it in his journal as Satan's last stronghold. The anthropology courses, it appears, did not cover the module on projecting his own theological framework onto people who have no idea what theology is. In November 2018, he persuaded local fishermen to take him to the island. On the first attempt, he kayaked to shore, encountered 2 Sentinelese, threw them a fish, and paddled away without being shot. He interpreted this as encouraging. He came back the same day with 6 men waiting on the shore this time. He tried to repeat their words back to them. He wrote in his journal that they burst out laughing, probably saying bad words or insulting him. This is, genuinely, the most relatable moment in the entire account. Then a child shot an arrow directly into the Bible he was holding in front of his chest. He swam a mile back to the boat. He described this in his journal as evidence of progress. The following morning, he returned for a 3rd time. His final journal entry asks God whether it would be wiser to leave and let someone else continue. He concluded it would not. He wrote a goodbye to his family, asking them not to retrieve his body. The fishermen watching from a distance later reported seeing the Sentinelese drag something along the beach and bury it. Several fishermen were subsequently arrested for facilitating his access to the island. Chow's father publicly blamed evangelical culture for pushing his son toward an end that almost everyone who knew anything about North Sentinel Island had explicitly predicted. The Sentinelese are the victims in this story. They were defending their home against an intruder who had been warned by the Indian government, by every historian who had ever written about the island, and by an arrow through a Bible and who came back anyway. They have been left alone since 2018. That is the correct outcome, and the only one that makes any sense. Here is where the story pivots from contact history to something considerably more profound. Because while every expedition to North Sentinel Island was being repelled by arrows, a quieter investigation was underway on the neighboring islands. One that didn't require anyone's permission and didn't end with a body on a beach. Ancient DNA extracted from skeletal remains across the Andaman archipelago has been building a picture of who these people actually are. Not in the reductive sense of categorizing them for colonial administrative purposes, which has already been done badly enough. In the literal biological sense of tracing where their ancestors came from, how long they have been here, and what their existence tells us about the movement of our entire species. The methodology is the same that has been reshaping the Bronze Age history. Scientists extract genetic material from teeth and inner ear bones, where biological information survives longest, and sequence what remains. Applied to ancient Andamanese remains, the results were striking enough to demand serious attention. The Andamanese, including almost certainly the Sentinelese as the most isolated population of the group, carry ancestry that traces back to some of the earliest modern humans to leave Africa. Their lineage does not connect neatly to any mainland Asian population. It sits apart, ancient, remarkably intact, preserved by geography in a way that has almost no parallel anywhere else on Earth. Estimates place their ancestral line on these islands at over 40,000 years, predating agriculture, predating bronze, predating every civilization that has ever risen and collapsed while they continued fishing from outrigger canoes. The physical appearance that led generations of outside observers to draw confident and entirely wrong conclusions about their origins is essentially a red herring. Darker skin, certain facial features, these are adaptations to environment, specifically to intense equatorial sunlight, that have evolved independently in geographically separated populations across human history. Genetically, Andamanese peoples are far more closely related to East Asian populations than to any African group. The appearance is convergent evolution. The DNA tells a completely different story. What makes the Sentinelese particularly significant within this picture is precisely the thing that makes them so difficult to study. Their absolute, unbroken, arrow-enforced isolation means their gene pool has not been touched by the later migration waves that swept across mainland Asia and gradually absorbed or replaced most of the populations that once carried this early ancestry. Everywhere else, that ancient signal has been diluted. On North Sentinel Island, behind a reef and a wall of drawn bows, it may have been preserved more completely than anywhere else on the planet. The people the world has been trying to contact for centuries may be the least replaceable genetic archive in existence. To understand why that matters, you need to understand what geneticists have been arguing about for decades regarding the question of how modern humans left Africa and spread across the planet. The dominant model for most of the 20th century placed the primary dispersal route through the Middle East and into Central Asia, populations gradually fanning outward across the Eurasian landmass in a process spanning tens of thousands of years. That model is not wrong exactly, but it is incomplete, because the genetics keep pointing towards something that happened earlier, faster, and along a completely different route. The southern coastal dispersal hypothesis proposes that the first wave of modern humans out of Africa didn't head northeast into the continental interior. They followed the coastline, moving through the Arabian Peninsula, along the shores of South Asia, through Southeast Asia, island hopping where necessary, reaching Australia possibly 65,000 years ago, not gradually settling a continent, hugging a coast, exploiting marine resources, moving with a speed that the inland route simply couldn't match. The Andamanese genetics sit directly in the middle of this argument. Their ancestry connects to this early coastal wave in a way that later mainland Asian populations do not. The migrations that populated most of Asia came afterward, moving through different corridors, carrying different genetic signatures, and largely replacing or absorbing whatever populations the first wave had left behind on the mainland. The Andaman Islands, sitting offshore, accessible only by water, were bypassed. The people already there stayed there, and their genome retained the signal that everywhere else was overwritten. The connection extends further. Ancient DNA from Papuan and Aboriginal Australian populations shows shared deep ancestry with the Andamanese, the biological fingerprint of that same early coastal dispersal, preserved at opposite ends of its reach. A thread running from the Bay of Bengal to the Torres Strait, visible only in the genetics, documenting a migration that left almost no other trace. What the sentinel represent within this picture is the most intact, surviving node of that entire ancient network. A population that has been sitting on the same islands since before the dispersal was even complete, never absorbed, never replaced, never diluted by the waves of movement that reshaped everyone else. The arrows that have kept every outsider at a distance for recorded history have, entirely accidentally, preserved something that geneticists would otherwise give almost anything to study properly. There is something quietly extraordinary about that. The population the modern world has most consistently failed to contact may be the one carrying the clearest biological memory of how the modern world got built in the first place. History does occasionally have a sense of irony. The legal framework around North Sentinel Island is, by the standards of how indigenous peoples have historically been treated, unusually sensible. India declared it a tribal reserve in 1956, established a 3 nautical mile exclusion zone, and eventually settled on what officials describe as an eyes-on, hands-off policy. Periodic checks from a safe distance confirm the tribe appears healthy. No landing, no contact attempts, no exceptions, which John Allen Chow's case demonstrated is a rule worth enforcing. The argument for permanent non-contact becomes considerably more persuasive when you look at what happened to the Andamanese tribes that were not protected by an impenetrable reef and a reflexive hostility to outsiders. The Jarawa and the Onge were brought into sustained contact with the modern world. They were given medicine, settled housing, access to food systems they had not developed themselves. The intention was benevolent. The outcome was not. Within decades, populations that had maintained robust health and coherent cultural identity for millennia were struggling with malnutrition, alcohol dependency, and the specific kind of purposelessness that arrives when the entire framework of a society's existence is removed and replaced with something that does not fit. Some travel companies running tours near Jarawa territory were accused of organizing what were functionally human safaris, paying tribal members food in exchange for dancing for tourists. That sentence should not exist. It does. The Sentinelese, by contrast, are by every observable measure thriving. Healthy physiques, consistent evidence of children and pregnant women, a population that appears to be sustaining itself comfortably within the carrying capacity of the island. They have everything they need and have had it for 40,000 years without any outside assistance whatsoever. The zoo hypothesis, the idea that an advanced civilization might observe a less developed one from a careful distance without intervening, gets applied to the Sentinelese fairly often as a thought experiment. If an extraterrestrial civilization were watching us the way we watch them, what would we want them to do? The Sentinelese have already answered that question on their own behalf, repeatedly, with considerable clarity and impressive range. My own view is straightforward. Leave them alone. Not as a scientific preservation strategy, not because their genome is valuable, though it is, because they are people who have expressed their preferences about contact with extraordinary consistency across centuries of attempts. And respecting that requires nothing more complicated than stopping. The DNA paradox is real and worth sitting with. The science that reveals how irreplaceable they are to our understanding of human history is the same science that makes the strongest possible case for never disturbing them to gather more of it. Some questions are worth leaving unanswered. The Sentinelese will almost certainly never know that their DNA is rewriting textbooks about human migration. They don't need to. They were fishing those reefs and working salvaged iron into arrowheads for 40,000 years before anyone thought to extract meaning from ancient bones. And they will continue doing exactly that regardless of what geneticists conclude in laboratories on the other side of the planet. The isolation that makes them scientifically extraordinary is not something that happened to them. It is something they have chosen, defended, and enforced with a consistency that puts most human commitments to shame. The genetics don't grant us access. They don't create an obligation they owe to human knowledge. If anything, they give us one more reason to understand precisely what would be lost if we ever stopped respecting the boundary they have spent millennia making unmistakably clear.